Welcome everyone. How's it, Miles? This is our 23rd session. If you can just think about that, 23 of these sessions, and in amongst those 23 sessions, we've had 19 either winemakers or property owners on. This was a project that started actually before the lockdown with Nats, and we were just sharing information about wines that we were drinking while we were self-isolating. And then the idea spawned that why don't we go buy a whole lot of wines and we can talk about the same wines that we're drinking while we're self-isolating. After that, lockdown happened, and so we only had so many wines that could see us through, maybe seven definitely we managed to get. But we thought that maybe we would be able to buy online, and that wasn't the case. So some people haven't had wine during all of those 22 sessions, and it definitely hasn't been the wines of the winery that we've had. But we've just sommergand on. And yeah, it's grown. There's a lot of people that are joining up now. And the whole idea about this isn't actually necessarily the technical details of what's in the wine. What this is about is about wine and what its purpose is on the planet. You know, for me, wine was put on this planet to help people engage and make eye contact and to share stories and to bring people together. And often, and very much so with this group when we first started, the wine category was intimidating, even though everyone drank wine, but if they had to go into the shop and see what that meant, it was scary. And that's the opposite of what wine should be. So we just started taking very approachable wines, $80 to $100, and just with the idea of sharing the stories behind the wines rather than getting into what Balling it was picked at and all of those kind of things. And that's very useful, and the feedback we've had is we do want some of that, but we really want to get into the stories. And that's what's made this so cool, is that we've got now 23, well, after this we'll have 23 profiles, personalities of the wineries or the wine producers. And each one of those will be a chapter in a book. And I refer to chapters in the book because we'll look at Miles Wines later. And I didn't meet Miles at Spuchwein, but Spuchwein is where this concept came up to me. I went to the original Spuchwein, which was Adam Mason, it was Sebastian Beaumont, Tyrrell, Myberg, and Artie Badenhorst. And they all stood up and said a speech, and the speeches were all the same, that wine is a social tool. And if you drink a lot of it, it'll make you clever. So I went and drank a hell of a lot, and I became very clever. And I think that's the way we should be selling this wine. And it doesn't matter what price point. You should enjoy it by socially connecting. And subsequent to that, why I'm mentioning Spuchwein is because Miles and Bevan and Gordon have also joined on. And these are the wines that we would ordinarily use on our tours that we give, because these are we call it the crazies. Anyway, without any further ado, Miles is here. Thanks, Miles, for popping in.
Yeah, Harry, thanks very much. Yeah, very intriguing concept. I know there's lots of Zoom tastings going on, and I've done quite a few for a couple of wine clubs and a few wine shops and my agents in Germany or Skype as well. And I mean, they generally revolve around specifically presenting a wine, which is quite tricky. Often when the people, for the crowd in Germany, it was easy. They all bought the wine and then they sat there and they all drank the wine. But I've done a couple for South Africans. And the last one I did was for the Buxton crowd in Durban, and I was opening all the bottles in front of the camera, and eventually one guy just came back. He said, "Please stop doing that. I'm on pineapple beer now. I don't want to see you opening wine anymore." But no, this is really what wine is about. It is about stories, and I think all of us, you mentioned those names, are all close friends of mine, and we all got into this industry, some through their parents who perhaps farmed or made wine, or some of us just through the love of it, the passion for it, and the fact that it does get people together and it creates stories. And for me, the most important thing is sitting around a table enjoying food. It's such a cliche, but enjoying food and wine, that is one of the most important pleasures of life. So I definitely got into it for a lifestyle reason. I was studying geology before I studied wine, and I actually graduated as a geologist, and then I went back to university. And the reason why I did it was I realized that geology, although interesting, for me, it wasn't going to lead to what I thought was going to be a great lifestyle I wanted to lead. And wine presented that opportunity. And my father was in wine, so it was sort of he almost helped lead me into it. But
he wasn't just in wine, Miles. He wasn't just in wine. He was.
Yeah. My father was actually, wine was not his thing. The family business, the Mossop business for generations, was leather tanning. Everyone knows that Wellington has the nickname Smellington, and that was because of the Mossop tannery that was there. And there was a Mossop tannery on the Liesbeek River in the middle of Rondebosch for almost a century before it moved out to Parow. But wine was my father's passion. So I think if he could have, he would have studied wine, and he wouldn't have just got into the family business. But wine was definitely his passion. He was a wine collector, Cape wine master. All his holidays were revolved around wine and enjoying wine, and traveling to different wine destinations, and definitely introduced me to the product. We would always enjoy wine at the table at dinner time as youngsters. I'm talking even primary school. We were allowed to have a small taste of the wine and enjoy it, as long as we offered an opinion. Then we could perhaps have another little sip. So it was definitely rubbed off on me without knowing it. When I started at varsity, I don't think I drank much wine at the end of school. And then slowly but surely did go to Stellenbosch University, and once sort of found the joys of the likes of Chateau Libertas and Tassenberg while spending time in Akker. So that was sort of a good introduction, and then finally led into study of it.
So Miles's dad was one of the first. There was the first three that became Cape Wine Masters. Miles' dad, Tony, was one of the first. And he wasn't just passionate about wine, he was a stalwart in the industry. He provided so much information, and there's still accolades that are going out to him. So a big name in the industry. I just thought I'd add that because you're quite...
Yeah, no, he was a huge influence on me, and I think a huge influence in the industry when in his time, even up until his passing. He had a lot of respect, but people regarded him for his palate and his opinion. And he was one of the guys who founded the South African Port Producers Association right in the beginning, with all the guys in Collerstorp, because my father made a small amount of port in Collerstorp. He bought a small farm for lifestyle choice, and then planted some port grapes and started making port. And that was Axial Port. That at one stage was the most successful wine on platters, because of its first 6 vintages, I think it got 7 vintages, it got 5 or 6 5-stars in platter. And actually in barrel right now, I've got a port which is going to be bottled in his honor. So next year there'll be a port coming out under the Miles Mossop Wines label in
awesome.
honor of him. Yeah.
No, that's very cool. Yeah, we had the graduation. We were supposed to have the Cape Wine Masters graduation at the beginning of this month, but we couldn't. So we had a Zoom AGM, and just we had 4 new graduates, and you guys, you remember Buller came on, and then there was Lisha Nelson, Wanda Cunha, and a lady called Corin Bloom. Anyway, we had it on today, and it wasn't the celebration of drinking copious amounts of wine and dancing, but it was impressive. We had over 50 people, Cape Wine Masters, saluting these guys. So that was very cool.
Did Buller graduate now?
Yeah, he did, but he made it hard work.
I spoke to him the day, I can't remember, it was about 2 weeks ago. He put me in contact with someone, and he said he'd been up since 2 o'clock in the morning, and he was busy correcting his thesis, because he said it'd been handed in and there were just too many errors.
It's funny that he almost didn't get through because of the dissertation and the paper and all of that. Yet he's won all the awards for having the highest marks, and he passed all his exams the first time. So it was one of these.
Really.
Anyway, we had Bull on last a while ago, 1 or 2 ago. So you did geology and then went into winemaking, and then what happened? Where did you go? How did it? I mean, I know.
Yeah, so I finished my geology degree. I graduated, and my father actually came to me and said to me, is this really what you want to do? And I actually said, well, I'd been at varsity for a while. It took me 5 years to get my geology degree. And I said, well, I messed around a bit in the beginning, so I thought I owed it to you to finish. And I actually did quite well in geology. And then he said, are you sure you want to follow this as a profession? And I said, no, not really. I don't really think I want to, but I'll give it a go. And he said, well, have you thought of doing something else? And I mentioned, yes, I've thought of various things. And he said, have you thought of wine? So he sort of opened the door for me to consider it. Well, I had been considering it before. And then I went back to university to do it. He did only tell me once I got accepted back into university for wine. He then said to me, oh, but by the way, I did put you through your first degree, so this one's on you. I had to put myself through the second degree, living costs and everything, but graduated top of my class, and then I went overseas and I worked in Australia. I realized by that time, it was the South African wine industry had just opened up, 94, 95. Winemakers didn't really travel much at that time. Young winemakers in particular, if they didn't graduate, they just went to go work on their father's farm. And I went, there was this new generation of winemakers, which I was part of, and we started to travel. So classic. I went to Australia, worked in South Australia. I was trying to get a job in Western Australia because it's good surf, but I didn't get the job I wanted. But I got a very good job in South Australia working for a wine farm called Napstein Wines, which is owned by Petaluma. And actually Petaluma had just bought it a couple of years before. Petaluma is a very big Australian brand, specifically from South Australia. And the head winemaker of Petaluma, Brian Crozier, was world renowned at that time as being one of the top winemakers in the world and a leader in sort of real technical winemaking. So I worked in Clare, which is a tiny little town north of Adelaide, about 2.5 hours drive north of Adelaide. I think population 4,000 people, but they surprisingly have 3 pubs, which we spent a lot of time in. But I worked very hard at Amazing Harvest there, working with mostly Australians. There were no international interns working in the winery, making Riesling, Chardonnay, a bit of Sauvignon Blanc, a bit of Semillon, and Shiraz, and a bit of Cab. They pretty much do everything there, but they were really well known for their Riesling, interestingly enough, and their Shiraz. It's quite an interesting area. It's pretty much it's on the verge of the outback. It's almost desert. It's a bit like the Swartland, but their season is very late, and they only start picking around late February with the whites. I remember we were still picking Riesling, not sweet wine, but still picking Riesling and Shiraz when I was finishing up in May. And it was very cold as well. So this late season allows them to make these quite aromatic wines in a very hot, dry climate.
Is that Clare Valley? Is that Clare Valley? It's not Clare Eden Valley. It's a different place, or is it?
No, it's Clare. So Eden Valley is further south. Eden Valley is very close to Barossa. But Clare is further north. So famous wineries from there is Grosset, who's very well known for his Rieslings that he was making at the time. God, man, they're I'm now going completely blank.
Pusey Vale is from Eden. Pusey Vale's from
they're from Eden Valley. Yeah, but there's some really, really top producers there, and just a very different approach to what I'd experienced working in South Africa at Spice Route and at Thelema when I was in my final year at Tokara. I did my first harvest, funny enough, with Giles Webb and with Eben Sadi, because Eben was working for Giles and that group that owned Spice Route in the beginning with Charles Back. And then I came back to South Africa after Australia and went and did a little bit of a tour around Europe. And then I went to go work in California, and I worked in Napa Valley at a winery called Farniente. The thing about Farniente is that they were top and are a top Napa Valley producer, but they weren't making those typical styled big over oak Chardonnay and massively overripe cabs. They were making a lot more European style. So I really enjoyed working there. Basically just made a Bordeaux blend, pretty much Cabernet and a Chardonnay and a sweet wine, and that was it. And then I came back, and while I was working there, I managed to I was actually planning to stay in the States. I was trying to find work there. I really enjoyed America. I definitely could have lived there or stayed there for a period. And I applied for a few jobs, and I was struggling because of the work visas. And then Giles, my father put me in contact with Giles Webb for the Tokara job. And I applied for it, and I got it. I had never worked more than a harvest in a winery, and I got the head winemaking job at Tokara. And yeah, so that was sort of how my fate changed, and I came back to start at Tokara.
And 18 years at Tokara.
19 harvests, can you believe it?
Yeah. Just on that Tokara, because we did a tasting on Tokara, but that was one of our first ones, and we didn't even think of the idea of bringing people on. But Tokara started from, that was its first harvest. It wasn't like you went into a running farm. It was the beginning of Tokara. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think that was the lucky thing, actually. Giles Webb was the consultant on the design for the winery, as well as gave input on not the farming as such, but more what to plant. So how Tokara originally started as GT was looking for a really nice small holding, or a really nice place to live. He wanted Rustenburg, but it wasn't on the market and it was too big. That's what he was looking for. He wanted like Cape Dutch houses, and he wanted lawns and fields, and didn't really want to farm. And then he found this property which had no vineyards on it, but it had a beautiful, beautiful valley and a stunning dam and great area to put up a house and a garden and everything. So he bought 180 hectares of the Simmonsburg, really because he wanted a house to live in. And he didn't originally want to grow anything, but Giles actually said to him, you know, if you plant grapes, I'll buy them. Because Giles at that point, you think 1994, 93, Giles's wines were always sold out. You went to Thelema in August and they were sold out. They launched their wines 1 June, and by August they maybe had some Riesling and maybe some Muscat de Frontignan to sell. So Giles originally said, if we'll plant grapes, and I'll take your grapes and I'll use it because I'm always sold out. And then after planting, and I think Giles took the first harvest of the first Chardonnay in 1996 or 7, then GT decided, no, actually he thinks he'd like to build a winery. And then that's how Tokara started, and it just sort of grew and grew and grew and grew. So when I started there in 2000, the winery they'd been building it for a year, and it wasn't even complete. And I did my first harvest in a building site, basically. But Giles hired me because he was the consultant. And I think the idea, and I think what GT thought, is that Giles would be there all the time, and I would just be like the assistant winemaker. But Giles obviously had his own business to run, his own harvest. So he pretty much left me on my own. So it was daunting and it was scary. But it was sort of baptism by fire. And 2000 was the first vintage, and did everything on my own. It was myself and one other guy. We did 200 tons, 2 of us. And luckily it's quite a functional cellar. So, you know, it did make life a little easier, and got through that. And then that was the start of it. And over the years we grew and changed and developed Tokara and changed the brand, developed the brand and the styles of wines. So in that sense, very lucky that I didn't come into an existing place where there was a set style and a set way of doing things. I just made it up as I went along, basically.
But you know, there's a lot of players who put Tokara on the map. Obviously, you and your winemaking. But I know, because from a touring perspective, when I bring Americans and Brits or whoever it may be over, geez, at least half of the time people want to go to Tokara. And so it's known internationally. And the wines, you know, you can pick up for $120 a beautiful cab, a beautiful Shiraz. Tokara is just good at everything that it's doing, you know. So, and obviously,
that was always part of the first brief given to me by GT was that he wanted me to make the best wine in the world. You know, I think as a banker you can be you can measure it, saying the best financial. I don't know. I mean, I don't know much about finance, but you can have the best performing fund. You know, it can be measured. So I remember that first meeting with him, and actually I only met him after I'd started working there for a week. Actually, 2 weeks. He was away on holiday still, and that's what he said. And I said to him, no, but I said to him, that's great, but he said, what do you think? Can we do it? I said, well, it's a very, very subjective thing. I said to him, we will try and make some of the best wine in South Africa. And in so being, it will hopefully be some of the best wine in the world. But he was adamant that he didn't want to be, say, taking the piss. He didn't want to be overcharging people for wine. I mean, Tokara didn't charge for tasting up until, I think, 2016.
Wow.
And it was GT. He said he remembers as a student. He says he still drinks those wines today, of those farms he went to, and they allowed him to come and hang out on the grass and drink wine. So he wanted to keep it like that. Eventually it just became untenable at Tokara. You'd have serious buyers there wanting to buy wine, but on a Friday afternoon, the Tokara tasting would be full with about 50 students.
That's what's grown into the art and the restaurant, and
So yeah, that was the idea, try and produce wines, especially with the Zonnenaam range, which came out first. And that's a bit what my introduction is about, that range of wines. Is make wines really great value. And they're not cheap wines, but they're not expensive. And you can really get great value from 100, as you say, 120, 130 rand bottle of wine.
Let's talk about, because most people who go under their own label sort of have a few years where they produce the label and they shift. But you basically were running your own label since 2004. So basically for your whole tenure at at Tokara, you had Miles Mossop Wines. And I went to a friend here, and he said, no, he pulled out a Miles Mossop. I said, it's impossible that it can be that old. I said, I just don't understand. And it was. I could see on the bottle, unless it was a typo, but I don't think it was. And it was delicious. But yeah.
That also might have been one of Wade Bales's wines, because I did a few for him as well. They would say Miles Mossop on the label.
Oh.
And then those Biozone, those sort of wines you put together for him. And those are always also great value. Yeah, I started with my brand in 2004. Actually, GT doesn't know I started in 2003. I bought some Shiraz in 2003 for myself to make a wine, and then the idea was make a wine and get it close to bottling, and then go and ask permission to release it. And funny enough, after the first year in barrel, I wasn't happy with the wine. So there's a 2003 Shiraz. The wine was perfectly acceptable. It was good, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do. It didn't have the character I wanted, and I realized Shiraz wasn't really my game at that time. So I actually sold that to Wade Bales. So that was the first one I ever did for Wade Bales, was a 2003 Shiraz, which is actually a Swartland Shiraz with Mourvedre from the Swartland as well. So I could very much have easily have been part of the Swartland revolution if I.
Jesus, well, you're before that. You could tell them that you started it.
Yeah, I started it. Actually, Evan helped me source the grapes, so it was care of him. But in 2004, in February 2004, busy chatting to GT and Giles in a meeting about my salary package, and we had won the year before our Sauvignon Blanc, the 2002 Zonennaam, had won the SAA trophy. Not just for the best Sauvignon Blanc, but the best white wine and the best wine on show. So I sort of gained a bit of confidence, and I'd also applied for a wine job somewhere else, winemaking job somewhere else, just to feel, just to test the field. And I knew what they were offering as a salary package. So I went to GT and Giles with a bit of a cheeky, perhaps a cocky approach. And I said, look, they were talking about how, they're happy with what I'm doing and they're going to give me an increase. And I said, yes. But, I think I'm worth this. And very quickly, I think they were quite surprised by it, but very quickly they basically said, no, you're not. But in that meeting, I never even suggested making my wine. But Giles put it to me. He said, no, but we're not going to pay you what you want. But we're going to give you a good increase, which they did. He said, but what we will do is we allow you to start your own brand. You can start making your own wines. And he put very specific limitations in place. We signed a contract, how much wine I could produce, what style of wines. And then that was the start of it. So first wines was the Saskia, which is a Chenin Blanc Viognier blend, and the Max, which was a Cabernet Sauvignon Petit Verdot Merlot blend. And yeah, that was a start, but very, very small volumes. I think the first release of the Saskia was 8 barrels. What's that? About 300 six packs. And the Max was about 400 six packs. And then it grew from there. Yeah.
But you started with your wife Samantha, Sam, and it's always been a family affair, and it's important to say this because you're mentioning Saskia and mentioning Max, and that's what it's been. It hasn't been, and I suppose it fits in with a whole artisanal small batch kind of vibe.
Yeah, I think so firstly, at that time, Saskia was born in 2003, Max in 2005. And initially, I was actually planning to make single varietal wines. I'd chosen Chenin Blanc because I love the variety, and I'd worked with it for brandy, and we'd made a little bit of Chenin Blanc for, there's the Max, and here's the Saskia. And we had made a little bit of Chenin Blanc for Tokara. And but I had found this beautiful old bush vine vineyard in Stellenbosch, which we're using for brandy for Tokara. Because Tokara brandy was pretty much always bought in grapes. And it was just I could just see the quality from this vineyard was too good. We make great brandy, but it was just really too good for just doing brandy from. So I decided to make the Saskia from Chenin. And then the blend came later. Actually, later in the harvest, I found some Viognier, fermented it, and when I was looking to bottle the wine, the blending worked really well. And the same with the Max. Was also going to be single varietal, but it ended up being a blend. And once you got blends, you need to, I to call it a Chenin Blanc Viognier, number one, in those days wasn't going to sell very well. But if it's a serious blend, they get names. And at that time, myself and my wife were starting a family, and it just seemed like an obvious thing. We don't have history of an estate, history of a family in wine, and so it is about us, our story. Really, it's the start of our story, and that's myself and my wife's story started earlier, but the start of our family was when we first started having kids. So we decided to name it after the children, and that was sort of the theme that we obviously had to take through. And then eventually to the Kika, which you were showing earlier, which was the third child. The shame, she was pretty much named because we had to make sure we could fit her name on the small bottle. So that's why she got such a short name.
Yeah, because it's a Noble Late, and for those who don't know, you just get so much less yield in a Noble Late because it's you get less yield. It's concentrated juice, so the bottles are smaller. That's why when you look at your dessert wines, I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. So yeah, the theme started there, and it's continued ever since in the sort of theme of our story.
Yeah. So let's. I think the introduction. So not your introduction, but okay, let's talk about it. So there's a real theme in your naming and your wines of stories, of books. And we've got Mel. Tim Mel's an author. He writes books. And I think that where this is going is that each one of these sessions is going to be sort of a chapter in a book somehow or some way. So I like that concept. But your wines are called the introduction and the chapters and in the family.
Yep.
And so, I mean, and I see a strong thing on Chenin on the border. So let us know.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So we brought out the family wines first. Saskia and Max initially, and then when we had a third child, the Kika, and I always get that story at tastings and people say, "Oh, you're going to have more children to have more wines." So that, I suppose that did cause a bit of an abrupt end to the release of wines. In fact, we had no more kids. By the way, I do have a wine coming out in August, September called Sam.
Yeah, I was going to
busy working on the label, and the idea is that in spring will be released. So that's going to be a very serious straight Cabernet.
Awesome.
And then I'm going to have the Tony Mossop Port coming out quite soon as well. So we continue the family as we go. But in 2010, 11, I was in Belgium, and my Belgium agent, Koen, we were driving around visiting customers, and he said, it's really great having your wines. Your wines are superb, but they're very expensive and they're quite tricky to sell because of the price points. And can't you give me something that's easy to sell and slightly cheaper? And funny enough, I had some leftover Chenin Blanc in barrel, which was destined for Saskia, which I just had too much that vintage because I buy a whole block, and it was quite a big vintage that year, 2000. And it was actually 11 was the vintage that I started. 2011 I was in Belgium. It was 2010 vintage, and I said to him, I've got some Chenin Blanc and I can bottle it for you, but I just don't have a label. I'm not going to give it another name and call it in the family range, because that range is the flagship range. And he was actually the one who came up with the idea. He says, well, why don't you call it the introduction? And I said to him, geez, I love that name. I'm going to register it. I'm going to label the wine. So the idea is the introduction to our story. So if you want our wines and you don't want to spend 300 Rand on a bottle of Saskia or 400 Rand on a bottle of Max or 320 on a Kika, and you want to try my wines and want to sort of experience them and what we're about, we have the introduction wines, which are much more affordable. And they still are serious wines. They've got amazing character and depth of flavor and length. They just perhaps just don't have the layers, and they won't last as long perhaps as the Saskia and Max and the Kika. So we decided that the idea is introduce you to our range. So some people said, but you're selling the wine short because they are really they're much better than what you're implying them being entry level. They're not entry level. They're my entry level wines. And so we brought the theme of the flowers through from the Saskia and the Max, which are the poppies, through to these wines as well. And actually the design of this label, if you look at it, we wanted to make it look like the title page of a book. So when you open the cover and you get to the title page, you'll often have the name of the title of the book at the top. You might have the author's name at the bottom or just below that, and then often have an illustration as well. Not always, but there are number of books that would have an illustration on that page. So we actually got an illustrator to do this for us, do the poppies, and we decided to make it like the title page, the opening page, the introduction to a book.
Can you see the picture there, Miles? Is it showing?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so the Chenin Blanc, it's straight Chenin. It is barrel fermented like the Saskia, just no new wood. It spends about 8 months in barrel. So it's made in a serious style. It's fruit from Stellenbosch and from Swartland. There'll always be little bits and pieces of maybe some Union, maybe some Verdelho that didn't make it into the Saskia, but they're small, maybe 5 or 8%. And it's a wine that I like to think is an everyday drinking wine, but it's still a serious wine. It's still made in a serious way. And then the red is...
It's one of my go-to wines because of that. It's approachable if you want to have people around. It's impressive. The stories, there's a whole lot that goes with it. It's not just...
Yeah, so that's really what you try to achieve with that wine, and it's done quite well for us, and the volumes have grown nicely. But I always want to continue making it myself. So it's not a 60 Rand, 70 Rand bottle of wine. It's 120 Rand a bottle, 125. But it is our entry into the market. And then with the red is a blend. I was going to do a straight Cabernet there to keep in the theme with Max, Saskia being a Chenin Blanc led blend, so we make the introduction of Chenin Blanc, and Max being a Cab led blend. But Cab is a very tricky one to make accessible and approachable when young. And when you do try and make it in those styles, sometimes it's, the stuff is weedy and it doesn't have the depth of fruit that I would like. So it's changed quite a lot, the introduction. It's had been Merlot dominated a number of years. But the current vintage is 2018, and I decided to move back to Cabernet dominated, like the first vintages. But I've actually brought in Cinsault into the blend. So there's 15% Cinsault in there, and all Stellenbosch fruit. So that's 100% Stellenbosch, where the introduction isn't. It's coastal wine of origin, the Chenin Blanc. But it's the Cinsault brings in, you can pick it quite early. So low alcohol, 12% alcohol, 11.8. But you still get this amazing expression of fruit. So it can bring in this lovely juicy fruit and softness to the wine. I use Merlot as well, which does contribute a little bit of that, but sometimes the Merlot, the alcohol is too high. Brings down the alcohol, and then it can help counterbalance the Cab, which is this big, robust wine with lots of tannins. So going forward, that's the plan. It might even one day be labeled as a Cab Cinsault on the back label, but at the moment it's Cabernet Sauvignon, about 60%, Cinsault 15, Merlot 15, and then the balance is Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc.
It's probably a good time to say that in the 70s and 80s, the South African wine, the big reds, were largely Cab Sav and Cinsault blends. Especially if you're looking at your Chateau Libertas and all of those wines that, people scoff at now, but they were well made then and they've lasted really well over the time. And I think it's because of this marriage between these two varieties.
Yeah, when I've done a couple of presentations on Cabernet Sauvignon, I did for Wine Mag, when they used to have their Cabernet report, and then they'd do these big tastings in Johannesburg and Cape Town when they were still in print. And then I did it for the Cabernet Collective, which was the Stellenbosch, the first one that ended up in Johannesburg, and I was on the panel. And I did quite a lot of research on Cab as a not just as a single varietal, but mostly for blending, because that really interests me. I love blending. And it's amazing how some of those single varietal Cabernets were the first ones that were labeling in the late 60s, mid 60s. Some of them would have up to 40% plus of other varieties in them. And as you say, a lot of Cinsault. Etienne Lariche tells a story of back in the day at Rustenburg when they used to make those Rustenburg reds with lots of Cinsault. And he said, no, man, the reason why they put Cinsault in there, because because back in those days, they didn't destem and crush. Talking back in the 70s, early 70s. They would just throw a whole bunch straight into those pumps, those old piston pumps they had. And they said the pumps wouldn't really work very well because Cabernet had such small berries. And it was so dry that they'd have to throw in Cinsault to lubricate the pump. So he said it would be 3 crates of Cabernet and 1 crate of Cinsault. 3 crates of Cabernet and 1 crate of Cinsault. And that's how they used to make their wine. But it definitely adds an interesting dimension to the wines. It really does, Cinsault.
There's just a question here, Miles, and I think I know the answer, but you buying your own grapes?
Yeah, so I'm it can be tricky at times, but perhaps right now with everything that's happening, it makes me very flexible, and I can adjust and change my business very quickly. I don't have any vineyards, so I contract grape growers to grow for me. A number of them I've been working with. So I've still got the original Cab and Cab and Petit Verdot blocks that went into the max in 2004 are still going to the max today. So I've been buying that fruit now for 17 vintages. So I try to work long term with grape growers. We try to work together, get them to do the practices I need with the same approach. And if it doesn't work that way, then often we part ways. And all the fruit is bought in fruit. Some vineyards I buy per hectare, so I'll buy a whole block, and I pay a fixed amount for that block. And some of them I pay per ton, depending on the grape grower and the farmer, how they like to work. But interesting enough, there's very few farmers who want to work on permanent long-term contracts. Most of it's really just a handshake and an understanding. And there's never really been a problem for me. I've never ever lost a vineyard last minute And sometimes, the farmer either pulls a block out, like the original Saskia Chenin Blanc and what I used to use for the Kika got pulled out 3 years ago. Try to get it kept in the ground, we couldn't, so I had to find alternative fruit.
Would you ever like to own a farm, buy a farm? That's another question.
Yeah. So I also don't have my own winery. I rent cellar space. I think you had Kathy Marshall on 2 weeks ago, and I rent cellar space with her and then one other cellar. So when I started Tokara, definitely that dream was to have a farm, with some vineyards and a little cellar, and you sort of live that lifestyle. The older I've become, the less I've wanted to buy a farm and have vineyards. I have lots of experience and lots of friends who've got properties and got vineyards and got staff and lots of staff, and it comes with its own problems. And then the only other reason, actually more recently, where I was thinking about whether I should or shouldn't, it really comes down to the legacy in the family. So I got to the point in my life where my daughter's 16, my son is 14, the youngest is 12, and you start thinking, are they showing an interest? Do you think they are interested? I don't want them to go into the business just because dad's in it and because there's a business there that they can go into. No. They must want it, because if you don't love it, this industry is very tough. So I could only imagine that I would buy a property when maybe in 10 or 12 years time, if perhaps my son or one of my daughters decides that they want to get into this business and want to make a go of it, then that would be probably the time that I would consider buying a small piece of land and planting some vineyards to really make a home for Miles Mossop Wines. And I'd love to do that with them, to grow that with them and develop a property like that would be fantastic.
No, that's really cool. So we've done the introduction, and this is where I've drunk a lot of the introduction. Less affair with your chapters. So, and I know that there were 3, and now there's 4 and potentially 5. I don't know. But tell us about the chapters, because that's cool.
Yeah. So this is a new range. I'm going to show you all the labels. So, and there's no significance to why a certain wine has a certain number. It's just when it gets released, it's the next chapter. So this is chapter 1, which is you're going to have them all there. Swartland Cinsault. Chapter 2, which is a Swartland Chenin Blanc. And we have chapter 3, which you see there, which is a Stellenbosch Chenin Blanc. And then chapter 4 over there as well, which is a Stellenbosch Sauvignon Blanc. Various reasons for producing the various wines. It's not all the same. But as I move around the industry, and around the winelands, I come across some really, really interesting, beautiful vineyards that I would just love to make wine from and bottle on their own. But obviously in the range you have, or I have, there was not a lot of room to just constantly bringing out new wines. And I find it confusing for a brand if they've got, constantly bringing out, all of a sudden now they're making a Roussanne, but they're Chardonnay specialist, and they still got it in the same range as their main range, or however you want to put it. So how it actually came about is I wanted to make a Cinsault. Main reason because I was experimenting for the chapters, for the introduction, and I wanted to make one Stellenbosch and one Swartland Cinsault. But also I love Cinsault and Grenache as well, which I find very similar, can be very similar in style. And I suppose they could almost lend towards a style of a Pinot, although perhaps they don't have the complexity. But I love having a lighter styled red wine. I love drinking a lighter styled red wine. I make Bordeaux blends when it comes to reds, and they're normally quite big and and heavy. So I wanted to bottle a Cinsault. Wasn't sure which one I'd use for its single bottling, but I bottled the Cinsault, which then became Chapter 1. That was the first one that I wanted to do. And it's really just a personal thing. I wanted to make a wine that was 12% alcohol, and I could drink slightly chilled in summer and drink a lot of it. And then Chapter 2 and 3, I found this amazing vineyard of Chenin Blanc in Stellenbosch, which was, the grapes were too pricey for me to even consider putting into introduction, and it wouldn't work in the Saske because the Saske is now almost all Swartland grapes. But it was just such an amazing block, 34-year-old vineyard, bush vine on Malmesbury shell soils, quite high up on the slopes in Stellenbosch. The name, there's a couple of guys who buy fruit from the blocks above it and around it, and they are serious Chenin players. And I just couldn't help myself. I had to buy a ton of grapes and just make a wine. And then when it came to the end of the year, I looked at the 2 wines that I'd made, the Chenin Blanc from Swartland for Saskia and the Chenin Blanc for this. And they were such contrasting wines, but they were made in identical fashion. Everything, the approach in the cellar was identical. Even the barrels that I'd used were very similar. So I decided to bottle a barrel of each and just have a showcase of the 2 different regions. And really, it's a bit of a geeky wine for those wine geeks who really want to try and look into what are the differences between 2 wines. It's the same winemaker, same approach, and the wines are made in identical fashion. And it's a Chapter 2, which is Swartland, and Chapter 3, which is Stellenbosch, and they're very, very different in style. Swartland is a lot more, funny enough, fresher, slightly lower alcohol, but fresher, and the Stellenbosch is a lot fatter and riper fruit characters.
Nice to have that, be able to taste the differences, though.
Yeah, that's the whole idea. And so when I first initially made these 3 wines, I didn't have a clue of how I was going to package them. And myself and my wife Sam were chatting about it, and I can't remember who came up with the concept first. Could have been her, could have been me, but we just thought, this is like a chapter, and these are like chapters in our story. As I move around the industry, as I get to experience different things and want to make different styled wines, it's an evolution. And so we're trying to think of names for them. And it probably was Sam just said, just call it chapters range. They just Chapter 1, 2, 3, 4. They as you move and change, and as things evolve, you're going to be having more and more chapters coming out.
And so it fits so well with introduction. It fits introduction.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that was definitely tied in with that. So then this last year, 2019, I missed making the Director Reserve White for Tokara, the Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend, barrel fermented. And again, the farmer who farms the grapes for the Chapter 3 Stellenbosch Chenin Blanc has an amazing old vine block of Sauvignon Blanc on almost the same slopes, slightly more east and southerly, so it's slightly cooler. And I know that block well because it used to go into the Milderbosch when Mike Dobrovich made those wines at the old Milderbosch. It used to go into his Blanc Fromé that he used to make. That block.
Is that the now Kanu? Or?
Yeah, but it's not on Kanu's farm. So it was always, he was buying from the neighbor. So it's just above them. So it's a good couple hundred meters in elevation above Kanu. And yeah, bought some fruit from there. We managed the vineyard, broke open the leaves. We wanted to try and move away from green flavors and get to a lot riper, richer flavors, and barrel fermented it. And the wine, I'm blown away with the wine. It's just turned out absolutely beautiful. So again, Sauvignon Blanc wouldn't fit in the Saskia. It doesn't really fit with the mold of those other ranges, but it really fits well in the Chapters range. So there's going to be a Chapter 5 coming out next year. There's going to be a Chardonnay from the Himmelin Arde Valley. So yeah, we're playing around.
I can't wait to taste it. And we haven't even mentioned, but Miles has won quite a lot of awards for his wines. And I just Googled Miles images, and I just see him holding trophies next to like people with one little baby trophy, and there's Miles has got like 7. So no, but Miles obviously has won a lot. Miles was also, how long were you the chairperson for the Cape Winemakers Guild?
Well, luckily, I actually read this while I was chairman, because I was scared at one stage of saying, Miles, you're doing such a good job, we think you need to stay. You only can be chairman for 2 years. It's part of the constitution. So yeah, I was chairman for 2 years before Bula. Right. And obviously you have to be on the committee and vice chairman before that for a couple of years. Yeah. So,
and now it's Andrea.
Yeah, now it's Andrea.
Yeah. Was she the first woman? No.
No, I speak under correction, but I do think that Norma was chairman for a period of time on the guild as well.
That would be
so
Norma
she's
Ratcliffe,
the first
yeah.
female chairperson, but yeah, Norma was chairperson at one stage. But yeah, that was a daunting task. When they put me on the committee, it was so daunting because I was a new member. I'd only been a member for a year, and you all of a sudden you in this. It was one of your dreams as a winemaker, one of your life's dreams to join the Cape Winemakers Guild. And all of a sudden you've got all these giants of the industry, if you want to call them that. I mean, a lot of them are your friends, but some of them like real legends. And the next thing you know, they put you on the committee and you're vice chairman. You're like, what the hell did that happen? And I said to my wife, I said, geez, I think I'm going to resign from the guild just so I don't have to sit on the committee and be chairman. But it all turned out well. It's fine. It was a great experience.
I spoke to Bulla and he goes, yeah, well, Harry, I'm glad that I've done it. It's like, it's such a big task because there's a lot of expectation, I think, and you're dealing with personalities. It's never easy, but it's also quite an honor. So,
yeah, I mean, you could imagine in an environment like that, and it's run by the members in a sense that they all get their say. And you got some serious, strong personalities and characters, and some people got a lot of experience. And now you are trying to steer the ship when everyone's got their own ideas. And you've got, really a person that you think is a legend, and he's not calling you because he wants you to try and get his will done. And you can't do it that way, and you've got to try and manage it. And I think that was it. It was a great experience in just managing people and managing things, and all kinds of things were cropping up all the time, and it was fun. I wouldn't have called it fun at the time. Well, I did enjoy it at the time, but there were periods when I was like, oh no, this is tough, but it all works out well, and it is a good experience.
We've had Carl van der Merwe, we had Kevin Arnold, we've had a few. But also, I mean, I remember when I think it was the first time I met you doing that Grenache tasting for the Cape Wine Masters, and you were on the committee. Why not Grenache? Why aren't you making Grenache?
It boils down to access to good fruit. So what actually got me onto doing Cinsault, I used to make, I don't know if any of you drank the Zondernaam Grenache. It was Tokara Zondernaam at first, and then it became Tokara under the white label Grenache that I made at Tokara from cool climate fruit on the Himmeln Aarde farm that Tokara owned. And we didn't bring it out every year because it's such a tricky place to grow Grenache that most years we just pick it all for rosé, but then some years we would leave a few rows to make red wine. And in the couple of years that I made it, if you had to look at my staff wine purchase record at Tokara, you would have found that probably the wine I bought the most was the Grenache, not Director's Reserve red or white. It was probably the Grenache because that's the wine I drank the most. Yeah, the white and the red and Chardonnays I put away in my cellar on good vintages. So I really missed drinking that wine and making that wine. And that's what got me to do Cinsault, was the fact that I was really struggling to find exceptional quality Grenache vineyards around Stellenbosch and around, all the really great ones are all snapped up. But there's a lot of Cinsault out there. There's lots of Cinsault out there. And this one isn't as old as perhaps the other three wines. They're all sort of, the Chapter 2, Swartland, Chenin Blanc, 48 years old, same age as me, planted in 72. The Chapter 4 is 32 years old. It's a Sauvignon Blanc, and the Chapter 3 is 34. So since it's relatively young, it's 21 years old. Wow. But still produce beautiful, beautiful wine. So yeah, that's why it was very selfish in the reason for making that wine, because I wanted to make a wine. Actually, all the wines I make because I like to drink them. There's no other reason.
So we're hitting now to 6. So I just want to share this because Sean sent me this picture. I couldn't identify you, and then I could. Can you see it?
I'm the little oak on the far right at the bottom, next to the big guy with the dark hair, we were unbeaten. And the reason was because that big guy, Grand Peravine, you just give him the ball and he'd run through whole teams. We beat Bishops, we beat everyone.
Where's Sean?
It was a legendary side, Miles.
Where's Sean? Where are you?
Can't you see him, Nat?
Second row, second from the left.
I guessed it.
That was when I used to
bits.
Next to Mark Moyer and Charlie.
Charlie Bent.
Yeah. I've got this. I have this exact photograph hanging in my cellar at home. Classic.
Cool. I'm going to end it. So listen, besides rugby, we're going to just wrap up. Obviously, everyone knows about the Vintners Classic, your surfing, your first love. And some of the articles say that that's why you became a winemaker, is because it's closer to the ocean. And then fishing. I haven't heard so much about the fishing.
Yeah, fishing is actually something that's come late. When I was a youngster, my dad used to fish a bit, but it wasn't really something I was into. But it's been something I've got into a lot more lately. One of the, so just talking about fishing in particular, one of my favorite places in the world to go to is Cape Infanta, near the Bread River mouth. We go there every year around Christmas, and there's not a lot of surf at that time of year because of the way the bay is set up. You don't get a lot of swell in there, but there's lots of fishing, and I just love just going out and just fishing. Yeah, I mean, I don't even eat much fish. I'm not a huge fan of eating the fish, but just nice to catch and just spend time on the river with my mate, Stoff. And it's really just, and my father-in-law is absolutely crazy about fishing. So there's always good fish in the house. But surfing definitely is a big passion. Another good friend of mine, winemaking friend of mine, he always sends out messages on our one WhatsApp group, it includes most of the Sportvein surfers. So it's like Bevan and Sass and Gordy, and then Evan's on that. Funny enough, Artie's on it, but he doesn't surf. But he's just on it because he's always good to have around. But Evan always sends out a message saying, guys, you mustn't forget, before we were husbands and fathers and winemakers, we were surfers. And you always got to remember that. And he's right. It was our first passion, all of us. And I became quite involved in the organizing of the Vintners Surf Classic for a number of years. I was the only organizer. And actually, the only reason was because no one else. It looked like that we did it for 3 or 4 years. We had the Vintners Classic, and then all of a sudden, no one was interested in organizing it anymore. So I sort of picked it up, and then for about 12 years, did the organizing of the competition. And it really is about just getting like-minded people. It's amazing how many young winemakers are surfers these days. I mean, the competition now, we have to cap the entrance. We have 46 entrants now. In the past, where we only ever had one lady who would compete, would be Trizan. We have now 2 heats. So there's 6 or 8 of them every year competing. So they have their own division now. In the past, Trizan used to compete in the men's division, and then she would always win the prize for the best lady surfer for winning her division because she was the only one there. But now it's quite competitive, and it's just all get together, hang around the beach, do what we love, drink good wine, and then have a massive party afterwards. But I mean, every people, yeah.
No, sorry. No, okay. So just so people know, and I have said this before, there's no other place in the world where there's a surf competition exclusively for people who are winemakers or in the wine trade. And then I do believe that everyone adds some of their wine to the red blend. So you've got this wine that's made from a whole lot of people.
Yeah, your entry fee has to be 6 bottles, 4.5 to 5 liters of bulk wine. If you can't supply bulk wine, then you need to bring some wine to the party. But most people do. And then it all gets blended. Alex Thierry now does the blending, and it all gets blended by him. He says there is some wine every now and then that doesn't cut the grade, that he doesn't have to, that he can't include, but he never says whose. And it gets put together and bottled in magnums, and it gets handed out to the to the competitors and to the sponsors. And then sometimes we would put some on various auctions to try and generate some income for various charities. So it's a very unique wine. And actually, someone contacted me via email yesterday. She used to work for Consol, and I gave her a bottle of the 2008. And she told me that she drank it last week, and it was phenomenal. I was like, really? That wine? I don't remember any of the big reds being phenomenal, but I'm glad it was still good. Yeah, so there's the wine generated out of this.
So also Kathy's board, she showed us, it's everyone chipped in for a board or made a board for her. So she's got to surf the competition the next time it's on.
Yeah, no, so her son has been surfing the last couple of years, but she's so badly wanted to join us and surf. So she's been up for the events, but she's never been in the water. So she's been taking lessons. I think she won a board, or Georgiana won a board at the last event. Yeah, so that's how she ended up with the board. And yeah, she's adamant she wants to be part of it. And it's amazing. I mean, people just want to be part of this event. I mean, we have sponsors. We are better sponsored, we have better prizes at our winemaker surfing competition, and we're talking from surf industry suppliers, not from wine industry suppliers, than the South African Surfing National Championships have. The people just want to be there. We have people calling us saying, what can I sponsor? I just want to come. I just want to be there. Like,
I've heard people wanting to become winemakers so that they can surf it.
Yeah, people wanting to become winemakers or somehow. So we've actually had to become quite critical and try and cut it down. So there's a number of guys who aren't winemakers who compete every year. That's because they came in the early days when it was quite relaxed and we just included everyone. So they're still part of it. But now, yeah, there's the guys who literally become winemakers, plant grapes just so they can come to the competition.
Listen, we're sitting at 6 miles. Flip, that was cool, man. And I'm going to open it up for questions. Does anyone have questions for Miles? I mean, it's not hard to chat to Miles. So if anyone's got anything they want to ask, just, you know.
Miles, I've got a quick question. You obviously worked overseas. Sorry, my Wi-Fi sputtered when you talked about working in California. Which winery did you work for there?
I worked at a winery in very close to Opus One called Farniente. No, not Opus One, but Farniente. So very close in that area. So very close to Yountville. It's at the time they weren't a very famous winery. That they did have very high. They were making in those days what was considered if you could make $100 bottle of wine in those days, it was the top end of Napa, and their cab was retailing at that point at $100 a bottle. They have another project called Nickel and Nickel, where they do these single vineyards. So it was a great experience. Absolutely loved it.
So from that, I want to ask, is there any winemaker in the world that you would love to work with on a vintage? You know, is there anyone, obviously you've inspired so many other winemakers, who has inspired you in the past? Talking Opus One, I mean.
No, so yeah, Opus One, I visited. So if I had to talk in the Californian or the US context, it would be Christian Moix. Would definitely want to go work at Dominus. I met Bill Harlan and his wife, and that for me would be a phenomenal place to go experience wine, because the Harlan wines are part of those super cult wines from California. But the ones that I've tasted, which is only twice I've managed to taste Harlan, I found amazing elegance in them. So for me, I love elegance in wine. I love balance. So that's why Dominus and Harlan would be the two. I wouldn't be worried with Screaming Eagle and a lot of those other wines. And then for me, absolutely mad about Bordeaux. So I met the winemaker at Petrus. I actually went to Petrus with Buller, and we spent a bit of time there. If I could just spend a harvest, even a week in that cellar, that for me would be phenomenal. I find those wines, they are amazingly ethereal. And I mean, I've only ever had Petrus twice, and it's not just because they're expensive, but the character of the wines are so different to the rest of Pomerol. The rest of Pomerol is just such big, blockbuster, juicy wines, and this wine just has this seamless sort of elegance in the wine. So that for me would be phenomenal if I could spend just a little bit of time in that cellar.
Awesome, thank you.
Petrus is Cab Franc dominated, eh? It's not the Merlot.
No. They're mostly Merlot. They actually got hardly any Cabernet Franc left.
Sorry, I always get confused which one it is.
Yeah, Cheval Blanc is mostly right. Cabernet Franc, but Petrus, they used to blend in Cabernet Franc, and when we visited there, he really said they have so little vines left. It's mostly Merlot that goes in. Yeah. The interesting thing for me when we visited them is that I expected a lot more, not technology, but I expected it to be a lot more technically advanced, the cellar, and it really wasn't. It was very simple. They still even, they use pumps, which I found amazing. They pump the grapes, which most cellars, in the top cellars in Bordeaux, don't pump grapes. It's all done through gravity and through conveyors, and so it was interesting.
Yeah, because Opus One is gravity fed, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
You eat on the floors in that winery. It's like a museum.
Yeah, I visited them when I was there, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, their crush pad is basically a massive concrete slab, at least half the size of a rugby field, and the lids of the tanks stick out through the top of the concrete slab. So Tokara is done on that sort of concept, but not quite to that extreme. And then you literally position your crushing equipment, your sorting and everything directly above the tank. And it's just the lid of the tank, just the cone of the tank sticking through the concrete. So you've got this whole slab and then these little manholes And yeah, and then it just goes all the way down into the barrel cellar. The amazing cellar, unbelievable.
Cool, man. Anybody else got any other questions?
Miles, do you think doing your geology degree beforehand gave you more of an advantage in terms of your winemaking and understanding of soils and everything else, or not really?
No, I definitely, from the perspective of this, my studies, it helped me hugely. So in geology, I didn't just do geology as my other major was geochemistry, and that's one of the reasons why it took me so long, because I changed my major for geology in my degree halfway through. And geochemistry is even more interesting when it comes to the similarities between that and soil science, because geochemistry is really the movement of minerals through rocks, and often it comes down to weathering and metamorphosis and all that kind of stuff as rocks change or as they break down and become soil. And that's really what geochemistry is. So, and with that, you do a very strong chemistry side. So it helped me hugely when it came to my studies. I mean, soil science for me, my first year in soil science was like I was bored in the class. I knew everything. But it gives me a good understanding and a good feel for when I'm in a vineyard and when I'm looking at soils and I'm looking at the bedrock. I have a good understanding of what minerals make up the bedrock that made these soils. I think it gives me, I'd like to think, a bit of an advantage if I'm trying to identify a new vineyard that I think might work. There's certain soils and certain bedrocks that I think don't work for certain varieties. But that's sort of become more something I've learned over time, to draw the correlation between those two. But I do have a good understanding of the chemistry, which is good.
Cool. It now sort of breaks into a sort of social thing. If no one's got any questions, you're welcome. And you're welcome to stay, Miles. You're welcome to go. I just want to say, look at where Miles is sitting, because it might look like that next weekend. Because we've got Sebastian on next weekend, and
all this Beaumont.
Miles, there was actually a question I had. Is, have you and Artie and Sebastian ever looked at doing some form of collaboration?
Actually, no, never. It's a Weinberg wine. I mean, Niels has really been involved in that, I suppose, from the Weinberg Old Boys side. No, we haven't, actually. It would be something interesting. We all make Shannon, so there could definitely be something along that line.
Yeah, you'd have a sort of a ready-made market straight away.
Yeah, you're right. Well, we just have to send Artie out there. He'll sell everything in the first tasting, I think.
I remember sitting with Artie, and he had Chris and Andrea on this side, and I think he had Eben on the other side. I think it was at the Cape Winemakers Guild thing. And he was going, listen, don't speak to me. I really don't know what I'm doing here. These guys are like proper. And he's just everyone else proper, and everyone's queued up in front of Artie. He says, no, I have no idea what I'm doing. This woman, she knows everything. It was amazing. Yeah. He's a good character.
He's a character.
They all are, man. Everyone's, one thing that we found out in doing this is that just how much winemakers have got to give, and how generous they are with their time and their knowledge, and then also generous with their stories and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the confusions, is people sometimes think that winemakers are not ordinary people. And but really, we haven't really had one where someone hasn't been generous with their time and stuff. But I suppose if they say no, then they're not going to be generous with their time. But we haven't.
I think continuing with that, is that the amount how winemakers are generous with their knowledge and their experience between each other. So we constantly sharing information and knowledge and techniques and giving advice. And I don't know many winemakers I can't call and ask for a little bit of a heads up or a little bit of help if I got a problem. And which is amazing in our industry. Not many industries work like that. Lots of industries are very closed, and people guard their secrets, and you're not allowed to share information. You sign confidentiality agreements with your companies that you can't share information. And which is funny enough, I had to do in California. I had to sign this agreement that I wouldn't share any of the information that I learned in Farniente. They caught me one day trying to photostat their SOP book. I got into a lot of trouble. I thought it might be handy when I eventually had my own winery. I could have my own standard operating procedures ready-made from them. But really, we all share a lot of information. You talk about Andrea. She is super smart and so switched on. But, she calls me for, I need a little bit of advice, fining. She doesn't really like to do fining, and she doesn't have a lot of experience in it. And so I do from Tokara. So She wants to understand a little bit about this fining agent or that fining agent. And then I called her about straw wine because I wasn't getting botrytis on the Kika, and I wanted to look at maybe making a portion of it as a straw wine, just so I'd have almost something in the bank at the beginning of harvest that is ready done. And she was very free. Came out, saw all the racks that she lays her grapes out on, and spoke to her about her techniques, how far she dries it and what she does. Freely gave me all the information on how to make her straw wine. So that's amazing, a great industry.
And then just there's a question: how do these guys get your wines besides driving to Helzwerchter?
No, so luckily, thank God, I put this online shop up in November. So it's up and running and runs very smoothly. It's amazing how cheaply one could do it, and the technology that is so readily available these days. So the best is actually, if you want to, is go onto my website and place an order, and I deliver for free. Just has to be in cases of 6 and a minimum of 6 bottles of any wine. You can mix and match as you want. So that's probably the best way to order, or just send me an email and I'll answer. We'll send you the wine.
Awesome.
There's but one thing I must say, geez, I went online yesterday just to have a quick look at what was happening in that space, and I was blown away at prices some of my wines are selling at. And I've given away no discount to any of the trade, but the trade is obviously everyone's clamoring for getting wine sold next week. So actually, if you want my wine cheap, it's probably better to buy it or port to port to wine cellar right now, because the guys are discounting. But
yeah.
Buy from me, support me.
Miles, last serious question just before I'm sure Harry wants to go to social. Yourself and Sean, what positions did you play in that rugby team, and what made you choose JP Boys High?
Hey, Wynberg Boys is the second oldest school in South Africa, so remember that. And funny enough, the oldest school is Saxon. They got the same kind of colors as well. I was hooker, can you believe it? I eventually injured my neck. And that big guy on my right was Grant Peregrine. He was the prop. And the other prop, he was at the back there. And when I used to go down to the scrum, my feet, that's why I was such a great hooker, because my feet were hanging in the air. I could hook so easily. I just had to kick the ball behind me.
Rubbish, Miles. I used to put the ball under your feet, man.
And actually, the next year, because I was very young for my standard, I played under 13 the next year again. And Artie Barnhorst was in the team with us.
That's right. Yeah.
But Artie was a serious rugby player. He was a serious talent, unlike myself. Won't speak for Sean.
Pretty much.
Craig, you'll probably like Miles more because he actually used to play water polo too with Mike. So at Stellenbosch
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good time. I played a lot of water polo for a very long time at Stellenbosch, but at the tail end, Mike came into the team and lifted the whole team there.
Just drank lots of beer.
No, but I even started playing water polo again in the last 4 years because my kids got into it, and I couldn't bear sitting on the side of the pool and watch them play. So, the last couple of years got back into the sport, which has been great.
That's awesome.
Miles, I got one question as well, Harry, before you go to social. From an experience point of view, because you're mobile and you're based out there, what's the best way to either with you or with one of your members of staff or team members visit you guys in a setting? Do you have a setting or an environment where one can visit you and taste your wines? Or is it still very mobile?
I'm still very mobile. So I live in Stellenbosch, up in Bunhoek. Got a lovely property that we live on. But at the moment, since I left Tokara, well, even when I was at Tokara, you couldn't taste my wines, but you could come and buy them from the farm. I haven't set up a tasting room. I've kept it quite lean and mean. I thought I would do that for the first year or two. It might have to continue a bit further because cash flow is tight. But myself and my wife have been speaking about putting up some sort of facility or just converting something on the farm that we could do a tasting on the farm with the wines. And what I would probably do is appointment only. So I've done a couple of appointment only tastings on my front stoep at home. and got in a group of people, and they come. And generally, in that sense, I've charged the guys. Said, look, I need to charge you a minimum fee for my time and for the wines I want to open, and they come, and I've done a couple of them, but it's all been appointment only. So I think the best is my email address is on the site, and send me an email, and you know, if you can get a couple of people together, that's ideal. So when you're outside of lockdown, it all sort of opens up.
That's amazing. So you say Bangkok?
Yeah, I live in Banuk. I'm just above Le Pommier.
Okay, near Rainbow's Inn, that kind of.
No. Just as you come over the past Tokara, there's a farm. So you're coming around Del Air. There's a farm on the right called Clouds, and I'm just opposite them on the left. And if you went around the bend, there's Le Pommier. So I'm literally above Le Pommier. We've got a small holding that we live on there.
You've got
shit! Now you just told us.
No, there's a big sign there. My wife insisted on putting a sign up saying Miles Mossop Wines. I said, you can't do that. Except people for tasting.
I was driving past there and I was like, flip, look there.
No, I've had people come and ringing the bell because it doesn't say on my gate. It doesn't indicate. So there's a sign on the pass. But now and people come and go, can we come for tasting? No, I don't know you.
No, it's 4 a.m. Come, let me sleep. Anyway, Miles, thanks so much, man. That was really cool. And thanks for your time, obviously. And listen, I've had all the wines. I had a 2011 Saskia the other day, and it was just so insanely good. So I love all of them. I drink all the introduction. I don't need an introduction to it anymore. Yeah, and thanks. Yeah, it's awesome.
No, Harry. Yeah, thanks very much. I am going to go now because I am visiting some friends. We snuck off to Bot River for a dinner. Saskia and Sebastian and Nikki are actually godparents to Kika. So, but that wasn't the reason we came. Just felt like a nice idea. But thanks very much. Did you say you had the 2011 Saskia?
Yeah, I had that. In the beginning of the year. Yeah.
No, it's because I just put a case of that on the Strauss & Co. Fine Wine and Art auction.
Oh, no, it wasn't through that. No.
No. I haven't delivered it yet, so that it'll be interesting to see what that goes for.
Well, it's delicious. Flip, it's delicious.
Currently running, but that's a good vintage. But yeah, thanks guys. I appreciate it, and lucky to see you, Mike, and lucky to see you, Sean, and everyone. Really cool. Thank you.
Cheers, Miles. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Dave. Cheers, man.
Yeah. Ciao.